Modern gardeners think fertility comes from a bag. That assumption alone explains why soil keeps getting weaker even as inputs increase. In the 1800s, farmers didn't avoid fertilizer because it was unavailable. They avoided it because it wasn't necessary. Their fields stayed productive for decades without synthetic inputs, bottled nutrients, or constant amendment schedules. The consequence of forgetting how they did this is obvious today. Soils that collapse the moment feeding stops. This isn't nostalgia. It's systems thinking that got replaced by products. Fertility used to be managed as a cycle, not a purchase. 19th century farmers didn't ask what to add to soil. They asked how nutrients moved through land, animals, crops, and people. Fertility wasn't something you applied once a season. It was something you maintained daily through flows. Fields weren't isolated units. They were part of a loop that included livestock, forests, hedgerows, kitchens, and waste. When that loop stayed intact, fertility regenerated itself. Once that loop broke, fertilizer became necessary. Manure wasn't fertilizer the way we think of it now. Manure wasn't dumped as a nutrient boost. It was managed as slow carbon and biology. Fresh manure was often composted, aged, or mixed with bedding straw, leaves, or soil before application. This wasn't about numbers. It was about stability. The goal wasn't fast growth. It was steady production year after year. Manure was valued for feeding soil life, not plants directly. That distinction is everything. When modern growers spread raw manure hoping for nitrogen, they miss the point entirely. Crop rotation did the work fertilizer does today. Rotation wasn't optional or trendy. It was the core fertility engine. Deep-rooted crops pulled minerals up. Shallow-rooted crops used what was available near the surface. Legumes rebuilt nitrogen biologically. Heavy feeders followed light feeders. This sequence wasn't about yield maximization. It was about soil recovery. Fields rested under pasture or cover for years at a time, not weeks. Without rotation, fertilizer becomes a crutch. With it, fertilizer becomes redundant. Leaving land fallow wasn't laziness. It was deliberate biological repair. Weeds grew. Roots fed microbes. Organic matter accumulated. Grazing animals cycled nutrients back into soil without extraction. Modern gardening hates empty space. 19th century farming understood that soil needs time without harvest pressure to rebuild itself. Continuous cropping without recovery is a modern invention, and fertilizer exists largely to compensate for that mistake. Farmers didn't talk about carbon, but they managed it obsessively. Straw, leaves, chaff, forest litter, hedge trimmings, and crop residues all went back to the land. Nothing organic was wasted. If it came from the farm, it returned to the farm. This constant carbon input fed soil organisms that made nutrients available slowly and consistently. Today's focus on nitrogen without carbon is why soils burn out. This part makes people uncomfortable, but it mattered. Night soil was collected, composted, and returned to fields in many parts of the world. Nutrients removed in food were returned to land. Once cities grew and waste systems separated people from farms, that nutrient loop broke permanently. Fertilizer stepped in to replace what sanitation removed. The system changed, not because the old way didn't work, but because society did. Farmers didn't know the names of microbes, but they knew the outcomes. Fields that were overworked became sick. Crops failed, despite inputs. Land that rested recovered. They protected soil structure, avoided unnecessary disturbance, and kept living roots in the ground as much as possible. These practices preserved fungal networks and microbial diversity naturally. Modern practices dismantle those networks and then try to replace them chemically. When concentrated fertilizers first appeared, many farmers resisted them. They noticed soil responded quickly, then declined, yields spiked, then flattened, structure degraded, dependency increased. They weren't wrong. Early fertilizer use often mined soil biology rather than building it. The long-term cost was invisible at first, but obvious over decades. Fertilizer didn't replace fertility. It replaced patience. Industrialization centralized food production. Livestock moved off farms. Crop diversity collapsed. Rotations shortened. Land stopped resting. Waste stopped returning. Under those conditions, fertilizer wasn't a choice, it was a necessity to maintain yields in broken systems. The tragedy is that fertilizer became framed as progress instead of compensation for lost systems. They used time, animals, plants, and restraint. They used rotations that built instead of extracted. They used residues instead of removal. They used grazing to cycle nutrients instead of exporting them. They used fallow periods instead of constant pressure. None of this was romantic. It was practical and often hard, but it worked. Small gardens are often isolated systems with no animals, limited space, and constant harvest. But the principles still apply. Carbon return matters, rotation matters, rest matters, living roots matter. Fertilizer feels easier than rebuilding systems. That's why it dominates. If your garden collapses without feeding, it's not deficient, it's disconnected. If fertility depends on inputs, biology isn't doing its job. Reintroducing those older principles doesn't mean rejecting modern tools. It means using them sparingly, not as the foundation. Fertilizer should support biology, not replace it. Perpetual fertility isn't a new idea. It's an old one we abandoned. The farther we drift from biological systems, the more inputs we need just to stand still. The farmers of the 1800s didn't buy fertilizer because their land didn't need rescuing. They managed fertility as a process, not a product. That lesson hasn't expired. If this changed how you think about soil and inputs, subscribe to Gentle Herb Gardening and share this with someone chasing fertility in a bag. Better food comes from better systems, not better labels.